Good morning. Welcome back to the WAWC conference. Welcome to session 2, in which we're focusing on transitioning from knowledge to action and the possibilities and hurdles that might present us with. I'm delighted to welcome you all back. We've got 4 exciting speakers up in this session, and I'd like to introduce first Jordan Hampton, who is an Australian animal welfare and wildlife management researcher. So, Stephen, if you could launch Jordan's talk, please. Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Jordan Hampton. I've prepared this talk for the session on transitioning from knowledge to action. And I've chosen to speak about wildlife shooting today because the last decade of developments, I think, provide a good case study of welfare research that can easily be translated into practice. And I'm coming to you today from Murdoch University on the west coast of Australia, part of the traditional lands of the Noongar people. Today's talk will be about wildlife shooting, but rather than going into a lot of detail about ballistics or a lot of gore, hopefully I'll provide some instructive case studies of how welfare research can translate into practice and lead to improved animal welfare outcomes. Hopefully it's of interest. I'll try to keep my talk to 15 minutes so we have plenty of time for discussion. If you haven't worked with me previously, I'm an Australian veterinarian and animal welfare scientist. Currently, I have a few affiliations. I'm a senior lecturer at Murdoch University. I'm associated with the University of Melbourne through their Animal Welfare Science Centre. I'm also president of AWMS, the Australasian Wildlife Management Society, and I've done a lot of work as a veterinary consultant for Ecotone Wildlife. And U4 was kind enough to recognise my achievements last year when I was a joint winner of an award for early career animal welfare researchers. So, just as a prelude to today's lecture, I feel strongly that in all discussions of wildlife welfare, there's a need to account for indirect as well as direct anthropogenic impacts. So I'm going to present a holistic assessment, as I see it, of wildlife shooting. And I feel that there's especially the need to consider indirect impacts on animals as we go further into the Anthropocene. And for this reason, I'm a big fan of the harms model of welfare, which I'll apply today. Briefly, my career has spanned a few decades now, and my first job working with wildlife involved studying feral camels in the Australian desert. Opportunistically, while I was working in the outback, I was asked to perform some animal welfare assessments of aerial shooting, which was contentious at the time. And this led to me spending the last decade studying different wildlife shooting methods. And I've gone from the deserts of inland Australia to working on seal harvesting off the east coast of Canada. And I'll try and summarise this last decade of work for you today. So, shooting is used widely, almost in a ubiquitous manner for wildlife management across the globe. It's used for commercial harvesting, in the case of macropods like kangaroos in Australia. Professional culling, we have a lot of aerial shooting of our introduced species in Australia. Recreational hunting, which is a global practice. We have a lot of hunting of deer for recreational reasons in Australia, and for euthanasia of wildlife under some circumstances, such as for stranded whales. But shooting is contentious, and it might actually be the most contentious tool that's used in wildlife management broadly when we think about shooting's involvement in practices such as trophy hunting as well. So some of this contention, but not all, relates to animal welfare, and a lot of this contention has traditionally been managed by the slinging of value judgments between people coming from different ethical standpoints. And unfortunately, there's been a common practice of referring to shooting methods as either humane or its binary opposite, inhumane, without providing technical definitions for what these terms mean, which hasn't led to a lot of progress or refinement in practices. And because wildlife managers felt as if their shooting programs were under attack from critical stakeholders, they began to try to defend their current practices. And historically, this relied on a public relations approach, which followed a predictable series of events whereby industries authored documents, procedural documents, either SOPs, standard operating procedures, or COPs, codes of practice, and these documents traditionally claimed that animal welfare outcomes were already optimised and the outcomes were already humane. But this led to a familiar conversation with stakeholders who were critical of welfare outcomes, whereby the industry would claim we're already 100% humane. Look, we have a procedural document. Stakeholders would ask, well, what evidence is that document based on? And industry would have little to say in response. And this shone the light on the weakness of relying on procedural documents in the absence of any animal-based data actually documenting welfare outcomes for shooting. And so, following this historical timeline, many wildlife management agencies came to the realisation that welfare scrutiny was not going to go away just because they'd written a procedural document. And so the next line of defence that was trialled was to undertake desktop-based animal welfare assessments, those that used eminence of expert panel members and purported to assess animal welfare outcomes in this way. A lot of heat maps like this one shown here were produced over past decades. This one was produced applying the 5 domains model of animal welfare to management of feral horse populations in Australia. But of course, there are important limitations associated with relying on eminence when we're trying to answer scientific questions, as I'm sure we're all aware. And this context was no different. Expert opinion can only take you so far, especially when there are very few animal-based studies to provide an evidence base for any assessments. And so there are major concerns about whether the outputs of such expert panels represent anything more than the opinion of the people invited onto them. So what else could be done to improve the scientific rigour of welfare assessments applied to wildlife shooting programs? Well, one good idea, in my opinion, was to apply an objective and quantitative approach. And luckily, as it turned out, scientifically, shooting is very simple to study. The methods of traditional scientific investigation make shooting very amenable to investigation. It's relatively easy to define clear and unambiguous outcomes associated with shooting programs. Animals are either killed, missed, wounded, etc. And by applying post-mortem techniques such as radiography using X-rays, a lot of the outcomes are literally black and white. So, myself and several colleagues over the past decade have developed some field-friendly approaches to assessing welfare outcomes for shooting programs. And these have relied on collecting data during operational activities, applying what's called a knowledge-based ethic, trying to assess and refine operational practices. So the data required for this are quite simple. They rely on quantifying the frequency of adverse animal welfare events, such as non-fatal wounding, quantifying the duration of procedures, how long animals are chased for, or how long they remain insensible after first being shot, and measures of efficacy, how many shots are required to kill an animal, etc. Combined with post-mortem examination, especially when using radiography, leads to some quite powerful tools, and you can apply traditional statistical analyses as refined from epidemiological studies to end up with quite instructive results for how to improve practices. Adverse animal welfare events are probably familiar to many of us from contexts such as abattoirs. They're relatively easy to define and then quantify for wildlife shooting programs. And non-fatal wounding is probably the most important and most widely quantified of these. Another highly instructive thing that can be done with the data arising from these assessments is to identify risk factors, those variables associated with suboptimal welfare outcomes in shooting programs. And so in the case shown on this slide, 2 different rifles firing different cartridges were compared for the culling of European rabbits in Australia, and it was identified that the lower velocity of the 2 firearm types examined actually increased the risk of non-lethal wounding by a factor of 8. So very important risk factors associated with small variables that aren't always obvious to people that don't have a background in the use of firearms or analysis of ballistics. This form of data analysis has been applied to many data sets collected from shooting programs in Australia over the past decade, and in many cases has allowed the variable that holds the most influence over welfare outcomes to be identified and to become a focus for further refinement, training, selection of equipment, etc. And in this case shown here, relating to aerial shooting, it was actually the training and skill level of the shooter that was the most important. So I've developed some recommendations for refining new methods for shooting wildlife. These are coming up all the time as new technology is invented. Air rifles are being used now to shoot some smaller wildlife species. There's lead-free ammunition being used increasingly for reasons we'll discuss shortly, but it hasn't been obvious historically how to assess these newly developed technological methods before applying them for broad-scale use. And so a simple set of recommendations has been defined, starting with benchtop testing, moving on to testing on cadavers, so dead animals using post-mortem data, then moving on to small-scale pilot studies before finally moving on to large-scale operational use with ongoing monitoring. And the table shown in this slide gives an example of what this iterative or ongoing refinement looks like for a newly developed shooting method. In this case, it was the development of some new technology for the chest shooting via ground-based culling for a large mammal species. And you can see in this table that as this program was rolled out, shooters gained confidence and familiarity with the equipment and target species and were able to increase their shooting distance, at the same time requiring less shots to kill each animal. And we were seeing a reduction in flight distance, or how far each animal ran after first being shot. So these animals were becoming insensible more quickly as the method was being refined. And so hopefully you can see that it's relatively easy scientifically to measure welfare outcomes for animals that are shot at. But as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, I like to apply a holistic approach to animal welfare assessment when it comes to wildlife. So I don't just want to have my blinders on for only considering direct impacts. Are there any other animal welfare impacts that should be considered when it comes to wildlife shooting? As it turns out, yes. I think the direct welfare impacts from shooting programs are really just the tip of the iceberg in this setting, because there's one particularly important indirect harm that arises from shooting, and that is the pollution of the environment with lead, the heavy metal. Let's quickly have a look at how this works. So, remember the X-rays I showed earlier? Many of them had little white fragments in them, shown here by these red arrows. These are all lead fragments. They arise from the use of bullets or shot from shotguns, but lead, as we all know, is extremely toxic, and many shot carcasses are heavily contaminated with these toxic fragments. So lead has been removed from many products in our societies, paint, etc., but not ammunition. It continues to be used. And so anyone eating meat from animals shot with lead-based ammunition is at a high risk of ingesting toxic lead. And this applies not only to wildlife scavengers, but domestic animals and humans. In Australia, we started looking at signs of lead exposure in our scavenging wildlife species, such as our wedge-tailed eagle, the largest raptor, and found a concerning amount of lead exposure, particularly in those areas in which shooting was common. We found the same thing in domestic animals, hunting dogs in this case, that were regularly fed game meat. And also looking at humans that ate a lot of game meat that was harvested using lead-based ammunition, we found some concerningly high lead contamination levels in game meat in Australia. And this figure here shows 4 different types of game meat, going from kangaroos on the left to wallabies, deer, and finally quail, which were the most contaminated with lead. And the findings of these studies have made a pretty compelling case that we need to start investigating the use of lead-free ammunition in Australia, as it's used in much of the world, but this requires animal welfare studies to ensure that any newly developed technology, so lead-free bullets or lead-free shot, is able to maintain or improve on the welfare outcomes associated with the use of traditional lead-based ammunition. And this has been the focus of several studies in Australia in recent years. Lead is not the only indirect harm associated with shooting. I just wanted to focus on it here today, but there's obviously other issues, particularly with the use of shotguns for recreational hunting of birds, particularly relating to the production of plastic litter, particularly from plastic wads used in shotgun cartridges. So, going back to the theme of this session, has all of this research led to any action? Have I been able to see translation from my work into what's happening on the ground when it comes to shooting programs? Well, I'm happy to say yes. I've been pleasantly surprised by how many shooters have been enthusiastic to adopt the changes that I've suggested and have been very interested to see the results of the studies that we've undertaken together. And so many government agencies in my part of the world and private contractors have changed their practices almost overnight after seeing some of the data sets and even x-rays when it comes to lead contamination. A few examples here. One is the adoption of mandatory repeat shooting for aerial culling of feral camels, which came about after early animal welfare assessments showing that non-fatal wounding was occurring infrequently. Another example related to the transition to lead-free ammunition for aerial culling of feral pigs, undertaken in one state of Australia. And a third example involves one wildlife management agency committing to having regular annual monitoring trips or audits of their kangaroo culling program. So, final thoughts. After a decade of studies into shooting methods, I'm pleasantly surprised in how readily agencies and individuals have adopted the findings of these studies into their practices, and it's been nice to see ongoing continual improvement in welfare outcomes associated. So shooting methods are very amenable to scientific examination and they can be rapidly refined. But I think there's a need to expand consideration of welfare impacts from those direct impacts on target species to non-target species, such as scavenging wildlife, especially when we're using toxic heavy metals in ammunition. And I've found that many stakeholders are eager to refine their shooting practices if they're engaged in a constructive and transparent way. And putting this into context, I'll ask the question that I'm sure is on many people's minds, but should we be shooting these animals? Well, I'll leave that question for another day, as this takes us out of the realm of animal welfare science and into the land of ethics. And this has been a focus for me in some recent work. I actually worked on a textbook last year with a few other colleagues who will be presenting this week, Peter Sandu and Claire Palmer. So they might be happy to talk about the ethical insights.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for an excellent talk there. I hope you're online. We've got a question that I'd like to pose. So given that shooterability was the premier principal reason for welfare issues of shot animals, what exactly did you do or require to improve this?
So I've never been heavily involved in the day-to-day management of any of the programs that I've studied, but some of the findings are pretty instructive. And in these cases, if it's the government or a private company undertaking the work, in many cases, they've gone back to the drawing board with their training programs and looked at how they select staff, how much training they do, and what science they put into the selection of the firearms and the ammunition that they select. I can't hear you, sorry, Glenn. I don't know. I'm sorry, mate, I can't hear.
Can you hear me now, Jordan?
I've got you. Sorry about that. I must have missed you for about 10 seconds there.
It might be me. I'll read the second question. It's interesting and encouraging to see enhanced best practice as a result of your work. So regarding lead, is there no appetite, to move to alternatives? In the UK, by comparison, quite a few people are using copper-based bullets, but there are issues of trajectory, etc. So I guess it's a question about the specifics of the Australian shooting practices, I guess.
Yeah, well, not just in this context, but I think everything's the same in Australia. We're just about 10 years behind.
And have you any thoughts on, I mean, in your own, towards the end of your presentation, you talked about engaging in a constructive way. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about practices of engagement to actually help cultures catch up, you know, to help shift cultures and bridge that sort of knowledge action challenge that we're exploring in this session?
Yeah, my overarching experience is gaining trust from the people you're working with is critical here. And I think refraining from any binary acceptable versus unacceptable language and making a commitment at the start of any program that it's going to be focused on incremental improvement rather than any suggestion that a negative outcome might lead to a loss of social license. And I think just broadly in animal welfare, that fear is what's led a lot of industries to be hesitant towards working with animal welfare scientists. But I think if scientists are happy to do the field-based work, they're happy to understand the techniques that they're examining in detail, and they have a commitment to try and provide instructive findings rather than categorical findings of a certain practice being humane or inhumane, I think a lot of the time you can build up a good rapport quite quickly. And I think it just so happens in shooting that because there's so much new technology coming out, most of the people heavily involved are actually quite keen to look at different ways of assessing new technology that might make them more efficient or improve the welfare outcomes of their work.
Thank you, Jordan. One last question. Good to see the use of evidence in change of practice. There is evidence that reintroduction of large predators can alter behavior of herbivores in a way that might impact welfare, e.g. altered foraging behavior leading to reduced body condition or deer hunted by wolves. Do you think that shooting could have any similar effect on the target?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually been some neat studies done in New Zealand where they have applied predator-prey theory from ecology to looking at changes in red deer abundance, time budgets, spatial use, etc., where effectively helicopters in the form of aerial shooting are playing the role of a predator in those ecosystems that lack a large mammalian predator capable of hunting those introduced deer species. But very much, I think in any population in which animals are being shot at regularly, they rapidly develop typical anti-predator behaviours.
I think we've still got a few minutes left. I'm just going to check if there's any questions I've missed there. I can't see any, and I'd just like to ask what your thoughts are about the use of the shotgun and its the contribution made by shot pellets in terms of that lead poisoning, lead contamination challenge that you identified. Do you see any changes there happening that you know might be worth drawing to the attention of people listening in?
I can talk about it generally, but I have to admit I don't have a lot of first-hand experience because most of my work involves looking at large mammals, and rifles tend to be the go-to there. The few contexts in which I've worked with shotgun shooting involve the use of shotguns for aerial shooting of relatively small ungulates, so feral goats, fallow deer. I know that bird hunting as a recreational pursuit is quite popular in Europe and other parts of the world, but Australia's moved quite consistently away from hunting of our native species. So there's actually not a lot of shotgun use for culling or hunting in Australia. But when it is used, there are the issues not only of lead fragmentation within the carcasses of shot animals and therefore posing a risk to humans that eat that meat or wildlife scavengers, but obviously the historical issue of water bodies being polluted in the case of duck hunting. And I think largely that lead contamination issue has been addressed in most of the world through regulation that's been put into place in past decades, given that lead poisoning of waterfowl has been documented for over 100 years. So that's a pretty established issue, and I think regulation's done a good job of largely mitigating that risk. But when it comes to the use of lead in rifle bullets, I think we're very much in the middle of that process of trying to establish the evidence base for why it's bad, show that there's viable alternatives, and try and look for effective ways to encourage agencies, companies and individuals to try and transition towards the use of non-toxic products.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And I think it's great that you've managed to present so many different elements there of how knowledge can inform changes in practice, changes in action. So that's wonderful. I think we're running neatly to time, and I think if we could transition now to the next talk, And we'll see you again, Jordan, for the panel discussion in a little while. So our next speaker is Madeleine Campbell. And I guess without further ado, Stephen, can I invite you to switch to Madeleine's talk, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to join the conference today. The subject which I've been asked to think about how we might find common ground amongst those with different views when we're thinking about decision making around animal welfare is one which I've really enjoyed having a chance to consider, particularly in relation to wildlife management. It's one, of course, which spans all kinds of interactions between humans and non-human animals. But I think it's particularly interesting in the context of wildlife management because of the various questions which are specific to that context, and I'm going to come on and discuss those in a few minutes' time. I should make the point as I start that despite the title, I'm not really a proper philosopher. I'm very much an applied ethicist, and so that is the lens through which I will be looking at this question. The first question, I suppose, really is why we might have different views about ethical issues surrounding interactions between human and non-human animals, whether we're talking about wildlife management or any other kind of interaction. Often I think we have different views and different approaches because we come to the question with a different starting point, with a different view about the moral status of animals. And of course, historically, animals were very much thought of as a means to an end. The idea was that they were somehow morally very different from humans. In the days before Jeremy Bentham, of course, that was related to their supposed inability to reason. And then we understood more and more as time went by, of course, that in fact they do have cognitive abilities and that they can suffer, very importantly. So really that old-fashioned view that it's just, you know, animals don't really have a significant moral status and it's really fine for humans to use non-human animals as a means to an end is hopefully fairly long gone now. But we do still have various different views about the moral status of animals, and of course those relate very much to some of the ethical theories with which you'll all be very familiar. And I don't want to spend too much time going through those now, but just to mention them briefly, probably the most familiar approach to all of us is a utilitarian one in which we consider harms and benefits, particularly in the welfare context in the question which we're currently debating, to humans and to non-human animals. And we weigh those various harms and benefits, and then we try to reach a conclusion which will either maximize the benefits to the most of the so-called stakeholders or minimize the harms if we look at it the other way around. And of course there is an ongoing question about whether we ought to allow the interests of humans to trump the interests of non-human animals or not, and that's a very current topic of conversation, particularly given the more that we come to understand about animal sentience, or sentience of non-human animals. Then, of course, an alternative approach is what's known as a deontological approach. So this is an animal rights point of view, a view in which animals have particular rights which are commonly encompass the right to life and the right not to be harmed, and therefore humans have corresponding duties to protect those rights. And that often also goes into legal obligations, of course, as well. In the context of wildlife management, the respect for nature approach is a particularly relevant one. And then we're looking really at the ethical importance of animals, not so much on the basis of the individual animal, but on the basis of a more species level or environmental or ecosystem level approach. And then, of course, we're also often, when we think about the moral status of animals, swayed by our relationship with a particular animal and how close or otherwise that relationship may be. So this, again, is very relevant to some wild animals with whom humans don't have much interaction at all. And the typical example of this, of course, is the different ways in which, as humans, we think about rats and how that is dependent upon our relationship with them. So you will be very familiar with the fact that the legal ways in which a rat can be killed are completely different depending upon whether the rat is being kept as a companion animal or whether it's being used in laboratory research or whether it is a wild rat. So certainly one of the reasons that we might have different views about the interactions between human and non-human animals and ethical decision making around animal welfare is that we have a different view at the start about the moral status of animals. And that, I think, applies to whatever interaction between humans and non-human animals we're thinking about. But there are particular differences, I think, around interactions between humans and wild animals, which are very relevant to the way in which we consider wildlife management. So an overarching question, of course, is simply how much we as humans should interfere in the lives of these animals at all. And a good example of that a few years ago now was when, in the course of making a programme, the Edinburgh team found that some penguins they were filming had got trapped, and there was a way in which they could easily allow the penguins to escape by kind of digging a pathway for them, and after some debate that was what they did, despite the fact that they didn't normally interfere when they're making these wildlife films. So there was a very interesting ethical debate around that and why they had made the decision to interfere in that particular case. It's always contextual, of course. So when we're thinking about wildlife management, we always have to seat that within the context of the culture at a national and an international level. And an interesting example of that, which I've been involved in some work upon recently, is the fact that interacting with and trapping wild animals for fur is very important to some indigenous communities, particularly those in Northern America. And so there we have a particularly sensitive balance to consider between the welfare of wild animals and the well-being of indigenous communities. And of course, there are also always many conflicts between the interests of humans and the interests of non-human wild animals. And you will be extremely familiar with many of those. So the classic one, obviously, is where we have large animals in particular destroying crops upon which human communities are dependent. And another example, which I stumbled across while sitting in a waiting chair at a dentist recently, was the way in which the growth of safari tourism and the number of vehicles which hone in when there's been a kill by large cats to witness that is having an undoubted negative effect on the welfare of those particular non-human animals as the game reserves effectively become overcrowded. And of course, there's a real tension there because the community, the local human community, for them being able to run these safaris is an important source of income. And of course, the kind of sting in the tail is that the fact that they do derive an economic value from these animals acts as a disincentive to hunting or poaching these same wild animals. So it's an extremely complicated conflict to try and work our way through. So given that we will come to any consideration of how we should be managing wildlife with different starting points, how can we deal with that? How can we somehow find a way of working through any given question so that we might reach a decision which can be reasonably and realistically implemented? Well, as is the whole topic of this conference, I think it needs to be a holistic approach. And I know you've been talking during the rest of this conference about land stewardship and collaborative approaches and the need for systems change. And it is, of course, absolutely true that wildlife welfare is a part of a much wider ecosystem health. And I think we absolutely need to be considering it in that context. We also need to be trying to base decisions around wildlife management in the evidence always, whether that be science or social sciences. So when we're trying to make ethical decisions, that should be based in evidence. And the decision which we reach needs to be consensual. I'll come back to that in a few minutes' time. And importantly, it needs to be enforceable because there's no point in having a decision which only exists on paper and in fact has no impact in the real world. So one way of trying to do all of this is to look for areas of agreement as a starting point. And I think given that we do all come to the table very often with different innate points of view, that is an important preamble to any further decision-making process. it's become really obvious that any consideration of animal welfare, whether it be wild animals or any other type of non-human animal, is in fact part of a much larger conversation about human welfare and animal welfare and environmental welfare, and how all of those things interplay with each other. I was asked just a few weeks ago in New Zealand to give a talk on the sustainability of equine sport, which really wasn't something I'd considered before at all, but it absolutely fitted into this kind of holistic approach. And I think the diagram, which I've borrowed here from this paper by Jones and all, is a beautiful illustration of that. And this paper itself, in fact, might interest you because it was around provisioning wildlife or how one might manage wildlife when there has been a catastrophe such as a bushfire. So when I sat down to try and think about how we might resolve the fact that we have different approaches to wildlife management and to the ethical issues which come up in the course of decision making about that management and to how we can best safeguard the welfare of wild animals, my mind was drawn back to some work which I've been doing over the last few years about an ethical framework for the use of horses in sport, and to whether or not we might be able to adapt that ethical framework to apply, in fact, to all interactions between human and non-human animals, and then specifically to wildlife management. So I'm just going to spend a brief time describing to you how this framework functions in order that we can then try and apply it to wildlife management. So as you can see here, it's just a kind of stepwise series of decision making or a stepwise analysis. And really importantly, it won't give you any particular answer for whatever question you plug into it. It's merely a method of reaching a decision or of having this ethical discussion. And so you can see that it starts off simply by defining the ethical question, which is we're trying to answer, defining any relevant regulations or laws, and then considering any relevant evidence, which could be peer-reviewed published papers, or it could be consensus reviews, it could be expert opinion, and often there is also a place for some kind of anecdotal opinion. And then we identify the stakeholders and their key interests, and we could do that by just using a simple matrix or table and considering what outcome each stakeholder would like and why from any given question. And then we apply what was called the three central tenets, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. And having done that process, then you reach an initial conclusion, you review it if there are any conflicts within it through re-reference to the central tenets, and then having reached a decision and a resolution about it, you agree a timetable for future review of that decision as and when the evidence changes. So that's the basic way in which the framework functioned when we were applying it to the use of horses and in fact of other animals in sport. So the question I've been pondering in relationship to this conference is whether in fact we could adapt that framework to apply it to all human, non-human animal interactions and particularly to wildlife management. And the gist of it, as you've just seen, is simply that it takes an agreed approach and then it works through identifying all the stakeholder interests, making sure that it's evidence-based, applying the central tenets and reaching a decision and giving a requirement for review. So that basic process, I think, ought to be applicable to any human, non-human animal interaction. And if we try to apply it to wildlife management, then again, if we look through each of those steps in the ethical analysis, I think all of them can be applied to any decision making around wildlife management as it pertains to animal welfare, to the welfare of those wild animals. But the thing we would need to thrash out, of course, would be what the central tenets should be. There is also an underlying question, which is whether or not the management of wildlife of wild animals by humans is at all ethically justifiable. So this was a question which I had to think about in relation to the use of animals in sport, and I had to kind of try and explain what the ethical justification for using animals in sport at all was, in order then to be able to set out how we might apply this ethical framework. So that same work would need to be done in relationship to wildlife management. What are the underlying ethical justifications for humans managing wildlife at all? And of course, there's already quite a volume of literature on this, and you will all be much more familiar with that than I am, but I've just put up a few example papers here. And part of it, of course, when we're considering wildlife management, is also related to population management requirements for the animals themselves, and the need to either increase or reduce those.
So, having established that underlying basis for what the ethical justifications for human management of wildlife are at all, we would then need to go on and consider what the central tenet should be if we were trying to apply this ethical framework to wildlife management. And when I was thinking about this, I think that the first two, which were incorporated into the use of the framework when we were applying it to animals in sport, would apply also to wildlife management. So those would be the minimisation of negative welfare and the maximisation of positive welfare, and compliance with relevant regulations and law. But the third one, the identification and prevention of avoidable unnecessary risks to horses or dogs or whatever animal it is we're using in sport, I don't think is applicable to the context of wildlife management. And I think there are some additional central tenets that we would need to incorporate. So my suggestions for that would be possibly recognition of species-specific welfare requirements, because of course they are enormously different across the range of species which we may be managing in a wildlife context, and also the recognition of sentience and the way in which we apply that to various wild animals. And both of those have caveats around them because we know that we don't fully understand either of those things. But I think we would need to incorporate them as central tenets if we were to try and apply this ethical framework to wildlife management. And there may very well be other central tenets, things which ought to be central tenets, which you, in your expertise, can identify and suggest for how we could apply this framework.
But if we could agree what those central tenets should be, then I think we could use this approach to trying to reconcile our differences in the ways in which we think about wildlife management and animal welfare going forwards. And I've just taken an example here of something very local to me, which is the question of whether or not deer should be culled on the Ashdown Forest, which is where I live. There's a large fallow deer population here. They roam freely across the forest, and in the course of doing so, cross roads, and that unfortunately quite often results in accidents, which of course impact both the deer themselves and people. And the bigger the population gets, the more accidents there are, simply because there are more of them roaming around, and of course because they begin to run out of food, and so they roam more. So a decision was made a few years ago that a cull was necessary to control the population for safety reasons for humans, but also for the deer themselves, because, as I say, they were running out of food. But it was an extremely controversial decision, and there was a lot of stakeholder opposition to it. So I was just thinking about how we might be able to apply this to that question, and we can certainly define the question very clearly. There are clearly applicable rules and laws around it. There are scientific papers we could go to and consensus views we could go to about the impacts upon deer populations of culling them, about whether or not culling deer is an effective method of reducing road traffic accidents, and there would be expert opinion we would factor into that as well. And then we would identify the stakeholders and all of their key interests. So those obviously include the deer, and then the residents, the visitors. Many of them have very strong views about this, the car drivers, the forest management themselves, environmentalists, and in fact landowners, because the deer roam on and off of private land on the forest as well, and eat a lot of grass, which is meant, for example, for sheep or cattle. And then we would apply the tenets, and you can see on the right side there the ones that I've suggested might be relevant to wildlife management. And having done all of that, we would hopefully reach at least a preliminary conclusion. We could identify any conflicts, where we could try and resolve them by referring back to the central tenets. And if we were unable to resolve them, then we can simply make a note of that, make suggestions for resolution, and having reached a conclusion, make a timetable for reviewing that as and when new evidence becomes available. So to go back to the initial question of how we might manage to find common ground amongst those with different views about wildlife management approaches as we move forward from this point. I think it needs to be a very holistic approach for the reasons I've explained, and I think we need to agree a methodology by which we're going to try to do it to start with, because without that it becomes a very circular argument and it's extremely difficult to reach a consensus. So you need to establish a process, all sign up to it and follow it, and that process, in my view, ought to be based in scientific and social science evidence. And then we need to undertake a frequent review of it. I'm certainly not suggesting this is the only ethical framework which one could use to do that. It's just an example of the type of thing I'm talking about, which hopefully facilitates finding common ground when you initially all come to the table with different views. So thank you very much indeed for your for joining in this conversation. I hope it's a conversation which we can pick up and take forward. And if there's anyone in the conference today who would be interested in working further together to think either about the ethical justifications for wildlife management at all, or about what relevant central tenets might be if we were to apply this ethical framework to the question of wildlife management and animal welfare, then I would love to hear from you, and you can see my email address on the screen here. Thank you very much indeed once again for the invitation to join.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. Madeleine's unfortunately not with us to take any questions, so we're going to move through to the next talk. These next two talks, both speakers will be taking questions as part of the panel discussion. So first up, we have Phil Riordan, who is the Conservation Director at Marwell Zoo. So Stephen, if I could ask you to play Phil's talk, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Philip Riordan from Marwell Wildlife, and I want to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak at this interesting and important meeting. The title I've been given is apt, and I want to present an example around some of the conservation management actions we take in response to drought in northern Kenya and the protection of endangered grevy's zebra populations. The grevy's zebra is an endangered equid that is highly adapted to living in the arid environments of the Horn of Africa. Grevy's zebra suffered severe population reductions between the late 1970s and the early 2000s, from approximately 16,000 individuals globally to around 2,000 individuals in the year 2004. Numbers have since increased to approximately 3,000 individuals, the majority of which occur in northern Kenya, with a population of approximately 300 still remaining in Ethiopia. Conservation efforts by Kenyan and Ethiopian governments, with the support of charities and NGOs, have been underpinned by a succession of action plans. Despite the conservation success for the species in terms of population recovery, and the trends appear good still, analysis that we've carried out using data from animals that were previously fitted with GPS collars has shown that seasonal movements are becoming restricted. From these maps, shown as high movement capability in red and lower movement connectivity in blue, during particularly dry seasons, elements of their range in the north appear to be becoming sort of increasingly isolated. More detailed analysis has also revealed that subpopulations within the southern portion of their range are also becoming restricted in terms of movement, and that again is being exacerbated during these dry conditions. The threats facing the endangered grevy's zebra include climate change-induced alterations to resource availability throughout the year and over longer periods of time. Patterns of forage and water availability are fundamental to the basic biology of the species, such as the timing of reproduction and seasonal migrations, are now presenting urgent challenges. These changes are not solely being felt by grevy's zebra and other wildlife, such as elephant and giraffe, but are also now causing devastating consequences to people living in this region. Famine alerts are more frequent, and the ability of governments to respond adequately are uncertain. Since 2020, the Horn of Africa has been experiencing severe drought, with some areas not receiving adequate rain since 2016. This has led to approximately 40 million people impacted, including acute food insecurity and malnutrition, severely reduced access to water and loss of livelihood, with over 10 million livestock dying. Against this backdrop, and the efforts being put in place to alleviate suffering of the people in the region, we've also identified the need to provide forage and other resources to threatened wildlife, including zebras in the north of Kenya. Each year since 2021, with our partners at the Muir Trust and Kenya Wildlife Service, we've provided hay for the Grevy's zebra during the most acute periods of drought. While our community teams ensure target animals receive food, this hay also offers relief to other species, such as the base oryx seen here in the background. The use of this resource by other species, particularly elephant, can also lead to increased conflict and issues with communities, which we of course have to take very seriously and tackle. The amount of forage that we have provided to Grevy zebra has increased since 2021, measured as the number of bales of hay here, with additional nutritional supplements being added, particularly since the early days of solely adding molasses. Our teams were required to work against the limitations of what was available and also the funding resources we were able to deploy as prices rose inevitably steeply. Despite our efforts, the health of animals was impacted. Parasite loads, for example, were found to have increased, particularly in foals, where their underdeveloped immune systems resulted from the nutritional deficiencies. Foals were consequently very vulnerable to helminth infections, with roundworm and tapeworms found in high numbers, leading to gastric upset, obstruction, and ultimately death on occasions. Sourcing approximate medications has remained a challenge, with scarcity or absence of veterinary or, for that matter, human medicines. Mortality rates were highest in Samburu South, and these figures from the Grevy Zebra Trust, where the total population is approximately 1,500 animals. Further north, where our teams work, we saw fewer deaths, possibly as competition with livestock and consequential persecution rates were lower, as the Grevy zebra population is only about 500 animals scattered over a much larger area. The observations during the drought periods supported the analysis I presented previously from the GPS collar data, in that Grevy zebra appeared to be associating more closely with human activity centres. While in some areas this might exacerbate competition for food and persecution, reports from our team suggest that attitudes of communities in the far north of Kenya were more sympathetic. For example, a Grevy zebra that enters the village of Alterod in clear distress was provided with valuable water and food by that community, who themselves were clearly in very short supply. Perhaps inevitably, and thankfully, the rains did finally come to northern Kenya during 2023 and alleviated the most urgent pressing concerns that we face with the Grevy zebra. And this photo is from Logtepe's community in the far north in Samburu. While we've been able to respond to this particular drought in northern Kenya, the indications from climate analysts and assessments is that these situations are likely to get worse. These projections presented through the IPCC suggest that the rates of moderate to severe or extreme to even exceptional periods of drought are going to increase to the end of this century. And that includes both the land area affected, but also the percentage of global population, human population, that will be impacted. Scenarios and analysis performed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, this from their Assessment Report 6, suggest a growing gap between the current policies in action and the targets that have been set by governments, resulting in a future where droughts and other environmental and climate impacts are likely to be exacerbated. And so this leads us to some potentially unhappy conclusions. Firstly, the future and the prospects for endangered species such as Grevy zebra, let alone the people that live in these difficult environments, is one that may require us to intervene and offer conservation management support with increasing frequency as we go forward. This presents challenges, of course, financially, logistically. As indicated, the availability of resources and the affordability of those resources is going to only worsen as we move forward. A further point is around the philosophical backdrop to the amount to which we are supporting, we're required to support what were formerly regarded as wild populations. We have to perhaps conclude now that few, if any, populations of endangered species, including grevy's zebra, are actually wild. They are under some form of human intervention or human management, indirectly or directly, and therefore we have a responsibility as conservationists, and particularly those of us concerned with welfare, to ensure that those animals have the best chance available against this backdrop of human-induced change. On that note, I will conclude by thanking our teams, particularly those working in the incredibly difficult environment in the far north of Kenya, but also our partners at Muir Trust, Kenya Wildlife Service, and the government of Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for a great talk, and thank you to all the people you credited at the end there for the incredible work they're actually doing. Our next speaker is Mike Daniels, who will be known to many of you. He is the head of policy at the John Muir Trust. So without further ado, Stephen, can I ask you to start Mike's talk, please?
Mike Daniels. I'm Head of Policy with the John Muir Trust, and I've been asked to cover actions taken by environmental NGOs on the basis of welfare evidence, and I'm going to draw on my experience with the John Muir Trust to give you a flavour of a case study. So I'm going to cover three things in the talk. I'm going to look at environmental NGOs and their relationship with animal welfare. I'm going to look at what wildlife management really means for environmental NGOs, and I'm going to look at the welfare guidance that's out there, and perhaps maybe we can explore how that could be improved. So for a bit of context, the John Muir Trust is an environmental charity that's just over 40 years old, and our main focus and mission is to protect wild places. We are a UK charity, but we're based in Scotland, and as part of our policy work, we sit within what's called Scottish Environment Link, which is an umbrella body of around over 40 eNGOs with a whole range of different objectives and missions. And a quick look through most of them, the word welfare doesn't really feature. And indeed, when you look at the overall umbrella strategy for Scottish Environment Link, and I looked here at the summary document, but also the document that sits behind that, and you do a quick search for welfare, animal welfare doesn't feature at all. And I think it's probably fair to say that in my conversations in my work in the last 16 years of the Trust, that animal welfare hasn't really featured highly. And I think the reason for that is is because it's probably more implicit rather than explicit. And if you go back to, for example, in our case, the John Muir Trust, and you look at the charitable purpose, the founding documents, if you like, the memorandum and articles that set up the Trust just over 40 years ago, there is a mention of protecting existing wild places so as to preserve their natural processes and their indigenous animals, plants and soils. So they are talking about protecting animals, but there isn't a particular mention around the welfare of those animals. And I think that's probably fair to say that affects a lot of the environmental NGOs and indeed the Scottish Environment Link movement. And then moving on to the second point, really when we talk about wildlife management in the context of landowning environmental NGOs, we tend to be talking really about killing animals, or culling as it's more euphemistically called. And that's really because it tends to be a situation where the animals are no longer able to be controlled. There's too many of them, or they're in non-native invasives. And so wildlife management generally involves culling. In the case of the John Muir Trust, We don't do any predator control. We're really about natural processes and try not to manage anything. The only exception we have is in the management of deer. And the reason for that is that the deer population that we have is 10 to 100 times higher than you would naturally find in a healthy habitat, where forest can regenerate itself without the need for 6-foot-high deer fences or tree tubes or culling lots of animals. And so the deer population has really reached a stage where it's effectively eating itself out of house and home, and if unchecked is subject to pretty significant die-offs of starvation in the spring around this time of year, actually, which is really a severe welfare issue for those animals. They suffer terribly as they slowly starve to death. So for that reason, the Trust has identified since its inception really that the problem really isn't to do with being overrun with red deer particularly, and that because of that we've quite open and transparent, and along with other environmental NGOs in Scottish Environment Link, we work in a deer link subgroup, and that includes RSPB Scotland, Scottish Wildlife Trust, National Trust for Scotland, Rambler Scotland, Trees for Life, Borders Forest Trust, a whole range of organisations, and we all come together and we're very clear that we need to try and address an imbalance that started probably about nearly 2 centuries ago now, with the creation of the Highland Sporting Estate. And what happened there was that there was this kind of Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, basically created this sort of vision of a Highland Sporting Estate with these wild, majestic deer being able to be hunted, which was all well and good, but in the process they basically have encouraged the deer numbers to increase. They banned anybody else from accessing the land. They created laws which made it illegal for other people to hunt deer, what became known as poaching. And the predators, although they had been exterminated, any other predation wasn't encouraged, and therefore the deer numbers, through habitat management and through not really culling enough, basically started to grow. And there's nothing left to keep them in check. So we really don't like big carnivores in this country, and we rarely exterminated the bears, the lynx and the wolves centuries before. So we've been really clear as a trust on deer that we have a responsibility to secure the land, and we have to manage it to the highest standards, and that means that requires us to cull deer. And we try to cull them in the most humane way, but we are effectively culling the deer. There is fencing, and we have fenced areas, and fencing is a temporary solution, but it tends to treat the symptoms, not the cause. And all it does is exclude deer from one area, concentrating their density outside the fence, or displace them into another area and causing a problem there. And it's not really a long-term solution. It might last for 10, 15, 20 years, and then when the fence starts to fall down or get holes in it, you're back to square one, and any regeneration you've gained will simply get eaten by the deer again. So what we need is a much more sustainable approach, where we have deer numbers at a density that allow trees to regenerate naturally, which is the case across most of Europe, most of North America and deer range, where there are a much lower number of deer, but they're in much higher, better condition, much bigger body size, much better welfare, and they tend to produce calves every year, or even twins, whereas in Scotland we have something called yeld hinds, where generally, because they're stressed nutritionally out in the hill, they only produce a calf every second year. And so the environmental NGOs have this view of the world, as do they in fact all the environmental public landowners, Forest Land Scotland, Scottish Natural Heritage, Scottish Government owned land in Scotland. We also take, because of changes to legislation that are coming in, the government has also taken advice from the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, and they have clearly said that humane deer culling can be an appropriate measure to improve deer welfare and maintain healthy deer populations, but perhaps the bit that's maybe needing more to do with is a clear framework of welfare around this management. So that brings me on to what guidance do we have when we decide as environmental NGOs to cull deer. Now, as it happens in Scotland, there are a lot of specific measures to deal with deer management, and I'll come on to them in a second. But actually, perhaps what we don't really have so good at, and what we've been trying to work with some other organisations to look at, is whether we should really be trying to develop a framework to look at, to place that in as to why we're managing deer. And I think probably within deer management we're quite far down that way. So we have, as I say, tried to modify human practices as possible. We tried fencing, we've tried diversionary feeding, we've tried various things. We have justified with evidence. We've got really good evidence to show that the habitat is being damaged by excessive deer numbers. We're trying to be really clear and objective. We don't want to be culling deer forever. We want to get to a number of deer where the deer can live in harmony with the environment without the need for human intervention or minimum human intervention. We absolutely need to prioritise animal welfare. So we have to make sure that deer are culled humanely, that they're using the right combination of ammunition, that if there's any injuries, that the deer are followed up, that orphaned calves aren't affected. We need to maintain a dialogue with the public about whether this is socially acceptable. We're very open and transparent about deer management, and we also need to make sure there's a systematic plan. Now, we tend to have good local plans, but there isn't really very good regional plans, certainly not a national plan. And then we want to be absolutely clear that we're not blaming the deer, we're not calling them vermin, but we're basing them on specific damage to specific public objectives in specific areas. And yes, and as a trust, we take that evidence, we monitor the heather or the habitat and the trees and see whether the deer densities we're getting are achieving our aims. And then, as I mentioned before, actually in terms of deer management in Scotland, there is pretty good best practice guidance on assessing and defining welfare, and on making sure when deer culling is carried out that it's done to the best.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's a great place to end those 4 talks with a highlighting of the way that John Muir Trust has engaged with the principals in their own practice, and has actually taken on the challenge of being transparent about how you're balancing your conservation and the sort of animal welfare issues within your operational work. We're now going to move into the panel discussion, so I'd like to invite Jordan, Phil, Mike to join us. We've got a few questions already in the chat, and I guess picking up on some of the themes, you'll all be aware, I'm sure, that as Pete highlighted in the introduction this morning, we are in this decade of biodiversity restoration, so we are being challenged to think about biodiversity net gain and to start evolving a lot of our practices in ways that will actually promote that, and which are going to challenge us in many ways to work out. And I think the example that was shown earlier about the fallow deer encountering our road systems, there are so many challenges that actually lie ahead. So I'm just wondering if anybody wants to say a little bit about how these different challenges actually interface. And maybe Pete, if I could start with you, because I think it spoke a little bit to that overview that you provided us with this morning when we were getting going.
Yeah, well, yes, and thank you to all the speakers, because I think we've looked at this from a number of angles, and that's been really helpful. And I think what we wanted to get out of the session, and of course, if any of the people listening in have particular questions they'd like us to address, please do post those in the chat. That would be helpful. But I think there is this, perhaps a bit of an underlying issue about how much animal welfare is driving policy, practice, methodology, rather than being looked on as a sort of sticking plaster when things have happened. So I'm very keen to see a sort of more holistic view about incorporation of wildlife into the driver of policy. And also, while respecting the value of species-specific operations, reflecting on the huge impacts humans are having on the ecosystem generally, and really the need to take a sort of more ecosystem-based approach to many of the issues that we're facing. I think especially as, I guess, very few areas of the world are not under the thrall of some sort of anthropogenic change. And looking at those climate change predictions that you showed, Phil, I mean, I think it is a very difficult situation, and trying to get a global fix is a real challenge when we want to look after the welfare of wild animals as well.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I'm going to try and tease out some of the questions that have come through and see if we can actually bring some of this together into some sort of coherent narrative. Some of this, I think, relates to the problematic dualism of nature culture, which I think still characterizes a lot of the discourse in these areas. So there's a question, I think this is primarily for you, Philip, based on the case study that you were talking about there. And I'll just read the question to you. As I understood your talk, you were feeding zebras in response to human-induced droughts due to climate change. However, as far as I know, droughts have always occurred, only not as often and as prolonged as now. So how to draw the line? And I'm just wondering whether you could speak to that, but also maybe with an awareness that there's a movement to actually get dictionaries to redefine nature now.
Absolutely, and it's a great question, of course. I mean, we are, in the case study I presented is a conservation response to an emergency, as was presented to us by the Kenyan government, who are the legal sort of stakeholders of their land, in brackets, their species, depending how we define that. And of course, throughout the period of natural evolution on this planet, droughts, floods have come and gone, and animals have adapted and responded to those conditions. And Grevy's zebra, as I said, have adapted to extremely dry conditions and all the physiological and behavioural adaptations that they exhibit. But as I said, and as you rightly point out, the frequency and the severity of these events is growing increasingly worse. And we have, as a conservationist, I'm looking at the urgency of response to ensure that the population survives. And going back to that sort of the issues around fragmentation and the sort of those landscapes and the degradation that is sort of actually driving these populations into smaller and more sort of fragile subunits across a sort of metapopulation, where they become isolated, of course, then that need for those interventions is arguably enhanced, and we have to sort of then do even more. So I think we have to sort of look at balancing what we might regard as natural, and as I said, and Pete, you just mentioned as well, there is arguably no more nature left, at least in terms of there's no more natural space left on this planet that is not in some way directly or indirectly influenced by human activities. If we take that as a starting point, then we have an obligation to do something about it. And that's that's the basis of conservation. It's an obligation to do something to rectify a situation that we brought about as a through the course of humanity. I suppose the short answer is we can't go back.
Yes, thank you for that. The not going back feels very poignant, actually. There's a question for you, Jordan, which I think it highlights just how much we've got to look at this wider system. And the question is coming in, looking at the predator, the sort of large predator side of things. So the question reads, do you know if your research has been used in studies looking at the humaneness of hunting of megafauna, e.g. trophy hunting? And I'm just wondering whether you can actually speak to the animal welfare aspect, but also in context. So with an awareness of the various bits of discourse about trophy hunting and about, you know, community interests and that sort of complexity. How do you situate the welfare question, and how do you make your, coming back to the theme, you know, the transferability of your own sort of research into action? How, you know, how do you sort of view that?
So just so I got the context right, Glenn, this is applying the science of measuring shooting outcomes to trophy hunting as a context?
Yes, and I guess there may be this wider context of, you know, the trophy hunting itself as a phenomenon, perhaps.
Okay, I haven't done much work on trophy hunting, but I'm aware of the ethical discourse around that. I'm sure we all are. Scientifically, there'd be no obstacle there to just apply what's been learnt from methods that are very effective and less effective for shooting other species to that context. So a lot of the science that has been funded by and designed for government agencies for professional culling programs has then been taken up by recreational hunters. So I think a lot of that science translates to any particular context, whether it was culling red deer in Scotland or introduced feral pigs in Australia. The science is pretty adaptable, and because ammunition's available globally, there's really not many obstacles to applying lessons learned on one continent to anywhere else in the world. But as far as the ethics of trophy hunting go, and obviously that's probably the most contentious form of wildlife shooting, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in that field.
And I guess moving to Mike, there's a series of questions in the chat there, Mike. I don't know if you can see them, but exploring, you know, some of the alternatives that you may or may not have considered as part of your approach to managing, you know, the numbers of deer. There's a first question about division in extremes in public opinion into perhaps, you know, the two camps of anti versus pro killing. So a question there about, you know, whether you're seeing that, and maybe how do you actually approach that as well? How do you transcend that sort of dualism? And then there's a further question which we can come to, which is about, you know, the alternatives, particularly with regard to contraception.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so I think the first one, we've done some public perception studies, and we're about to do another one actually. So we've got kind of opinion poll type questionnaires done scientifically, looking at what public perception is. And actually, interestingly, going back to that previous point, when you ask people in Scotland across rural and urban areas and across different demographics what they think about culling deer and what the reasons for it, they're generally, because of education, a long time history, that they're generally quite accepting of it. And they particularly for biodiversity, for climate change, for disease, human disease, there's Lyme's disease, which can be passed, for road traffic accidents. The one that they're not happy with really actually is trophy hunting. So, and that's the kind of classic shooting a stag for sport and dressed up in tweeds, the kind of Victorian thing I mentioned in the talk. So actually, apart from all those other reasons, people are relatively happy. And interesting, there was no split between urban and rural. We quite often hear this trope that, you know, the townies don't really understand what's going on, but actually, for lots of historic reasons, people living rurally in Scotland are equally disconnected from the communities around, from the countryside around them, or there's no difference. So so actually that's quite interesting. On the second point, I think going back to alternatives, and again, just to make the point that we there's something slightly ironic or contradictory that all the environmental conservation charities are calling for culling more of a native iconic species, red deer in Scotland. You know, it's not the same situation as Jordan's outlining, where these are exotic species that are being culled in Australia, understandably. These are native species. So, but the fact we're all doing it is interesting in itself. But we're all very reluctantly doing it. None of us want to be doing it. Ideally, I say we don't cull anything else, and ideally we wouldn't be doing anything. You know, we wouldn't want to be culling deer, which gets back to neatly onto the alternatives. And yes, I mean, immunocontraception, I think my understanding can work in a park situation where you're able to administer that to a level, but we've got a population of estimated around 1 million deer in Scotland now of all species. So you're talking about at least 500,000 female deer, you know, in very inaccessible places or in the woodland, a whole range of habitats. So the practicalities that aren't really credible, I think, yet on any sort of in any reliable way. So I think the bringing back the predators is one that always gets mentioned too, and I've studied a wee bit, looked at
wolves in Yellowstone, the reintroduction there, and also a bit in Spain. And interestingly, I think even, well, for example, in Yellowstone, there's still culling happens of the cervid species. So I think, as was alluded to earlier, we're so out of kilter in terms of trying to get anywhere near a natural system, and certainly in the UK, that we're going to have to be intervening for a long time. But hopefully at a much lower level, hopefully we can get your populations down, and then it's a much more, you know, minimalistic type cull. Hopefully would be the best we could hope for. If predators were introduced, for example, lynx and wolves, they would have some impact, but maybe more in behaviour rather than bringing numbers down at this moment. But if you got to low numbers and you had predators, they might be able to control them. But so yeah, the alternatives unfortunately aren't really looking likely in the future. And I think we've all alluded to that the biggest problem is all what we're seeing on the screen is our species, really. That's the root of all the problem. And in my lifetime, that population has doubled from 4 billion to 8 billion. So I don't know. Yeah, it's not very hopeful looking for the future.
Just on that point, Mike, and I guess linking this to what Jordan was sharing in terms of the contamination of the environment, you know, so often we overlook the sort of downstream consequences, and I'm just wondering whether any of you have a thought about how we recognise that a lot of our instincts will lead to unintended consequences. So, for example, if we start pumping loads of contraceptions into the environment, there will be consequences to the ecosystem in the same way that lead has led to consequences. And I'm kind of wondering whether you've got any thoughts as to how we don't swing from one thing to another and just have different consequences. And I guess this comes back to ecological literacy for me.
I'm happy to jump in briefly. I find this a fascinating topic, and Philip, I was really interested to hear about your work in northern Kenya, and what really pricked my ears up was hearing that you were using some parasiticide drugs to treat some of your zebras for roundworms, and that's become an issue in Australia when some researchers and wildlife custodians have been tempted to try and treat wild animals, particularly for parasites, seeing some of the downstream consequences on resident invertebrates in some of these environments. It's quite a difficult situation, and it's very challenging to try and effectively treat helminth parasites in an animal without causing impacts on invertebrate communities in the same environment. So I think that's a good example of a very difficult one, where good intentions focusing on the survival or welfare of the individual animal, the mammalian host, can have these often subtle impacts on the invertebrate community around them.
Mike, did you want to come back in on some of that?
Yeah, if I can just respond to that now, to Jordan, absolutely. I mean, the use of anti-helminthics and sort of, treatment around the world is a major issue. I think the contrast in this instance is we're dealing with a very small number of wild animals that are at immediate risk. The sort of indiscriminate use of these chemicals for livestock is causing huge devastation to ecosystems, and particularly in that part of the world, as many other parts of the world, and we have sort of lots of particularly sort of soil microbiomes is sort of is playing out in a huge number of foreseen and unforeseen ways. So I agree, and I think it is that sort of balance then of that sort of the intervention and the outcome. With a mindfulness, as Glen says, with that sort of ecological sort of literacy of sort of how we can understand those consequences to the best of our ability, and there's a lot of evidence and literature around that. And I mentioned also elephants. So we're putting food out for the zebras primarily. The elephants are using it, and that's then bringing them closer into contact with human communities. Now, I'm not going to go into the sort of the whole elephant sort of ivory trade and sort of some of the southern African states moves towards sort of legalizing that trade for their own economic benefits, as well as sort of addressing sort of elephant population control they have. But certainly, if we're sort of putting interventions in that are having an impact on the human population, we need to be working very closely with those communities to ensure that those conflicts are being monitored and addressed, and where we can to sort of limit the impact that might have. But most importantly, get the agreement with those communities, and that takes a lot of time, trust, relationship building, and that that groundwork is essential for any of this.
Thank you, Philip and Jordan. I think that just highlights the complexities that we're actually dealing with. And I'm minded that I've got a student at the moment who's looking at just the contradictions within a single nature reserve when you bring conservation grazing animals in, and there isn't a one health approach. One stakeholder doesn't know what the other one's doing, and they're not sort of being interfaced. And I guess with that in mind, Mike, I guess I'm assuming you've at the John Muir Trust, you're trying to bring some of these concerns together and into some sort of interrelationship. And Kirsty's posted a question there about how you actually are operationalizing the 7 principles. I'll just read the question for the benefit of everybody in the audience and listening in. So you've run through the international consensus principles for ethical wildlife control as they apply to your deer management. You mentioned the need for a national systematic plan in addition to existing local plans. So this is very much about operationalizing, really. Could you please speak a bit more about other areas you think more needs to be done to meet the principles? What sort of work, what needs to be done? Where are the priorities? How do you see this actually being engaged with at an organizational level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think just focusing on the deer stuff, I think at the moment there are when I mentioned the principles, there are deer management plans, but they're voluntary and they're kind of, I think they need to have some sort of statutory footing to make them, and they need to be, and therefore have some sort of government, either local government or national government. And I think that's the same for any kind of wildlife culling, really. There needs to be some sort of really clear plan as to what the numbers we're talking about, what the exit strategy is, what the techniques are being used. So I think that's that's in all of us, but I think that's at the moment it's very much a voluntary approach, and because of quite powerful landowning lobbying in the country, it tends to be that they think interstate interference isn't looked on as favorably, so it's kind of do things voluntary. But actually I think you need that regulation really to make this work. So so I think a lot of things are happening, and don't get me wrong, most people that cull deer, whether they're doing it for recreation or are very concerned about welfare and will try to minimize that. So I don't think that's the issue. It's more that at the level of trying to work out what the plan is and how we're going to get through it. That's really where it would come to. I'm not really so au fait in other species. I think you've got Jeremy Wilson on from RSPB and later on. I think he's certainly there. RSPB are involved more in certainly I think the Stoats and Orkney and other wildlife management, but from a deer point of view, that's really all I could say, I think.
And could you say anything, Mike, about how this, I guess, interfaces with, the other members of the communities that you're part of? Because, there are different stakeholders who are, I guess, engaging with, planning with, this idea of biodiversity net gain, with some of the challenges that we're having to plan for. When I think of the challenge ahead for universities, for example, as a significant landowner, we haven't really engaged with the principles. We haven't really engaged with, the biodiversity net gain ideas yet. We're starting to, and that's just one example of an organisation. And I'm just wondering how you, as an organisation, but also as an organisation who partners other organisations, are approaching this.
Gosh, I'm not quite. I'm not sure I fully understand in terms of the welfare side of it. The biodiversity side, I understand. Obviously, we've got management plans, and we'll try to increase natural processes and biodiversity. I guess it's where it interfaces with welfare. And I suppose the assumption is for most of us that getting natural habitats back and boosting biodiversity is going to be good for animal welfare. I would have thought, as far as we've thought about it. So I'm not quite sure if I got your specific question there, Glen. Apologies.
No, don't worry, Mike. I think it's about this need to develop vertical literacy within an organisation, but then across different organisations who are facing similar challenges and the contradictions between some of those challenges. The conservation and the welfare challenges. And I think that relates to a question there for you, Mike, about. I'm going to read this through. So good to see that the John Muir Trust works through the international consensus principles. Given that the principles cover more than animal welfare, how can we get environmental NGOs to adopt these more widely and thus integrate animal welfare by that route?
Yeah, so I think a really practical thing would actually be to have to actually work with Scottish Environment Link and the Animal Welfare, Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, or a group of this organisation, or I know Pete's and Cousquer involved in other things. I think to actually just trying to persuade Scottish Environment Link as a collaborative and a collective to adopt that approach. I think that would be the next best steps, really. I mean, it's funny. I think a lot of, I say, when I'm looking at that review, most people don't think of animal welfare in terms of conservation. It's not something we talk about much. We'll talk about health and safety for humans. We'll talk about fire risks, all sorts of things. We won't actually ever mention animal welfare, but actually it's because, as I say, I think it's implicit rather than explicit. And actually, when I speak to individual staff members, it generally are, most people have come into the conservation movement because they're very concerned about wildlife and animal welfare, and even sometimes animal rights. And quite often people are vegan, or they've got a whole range of, so I think it's very much an open door. It's just that it's something that's kind of just not really thought about. And yeah, I think there's an argument to say, which I think the previous talks right at the beginning are a very, very strong point, that these are all related. There's one health and there's one welfare. The animal welfare should really be much more prominent. So I think that would be one way of doing it, possibly at that level.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm noticing a lot of.
Got his hand up. Sorry, Philip was going to come in.
Yeah, so just on that point, I have to say, one of the main reasons that we're considering welfare in conservation work at Marwell, and I come from an academic background, so I'm relatively new to the sort of zoo community. But because the zoo community has been so obsessed, rightly so, with welfare for so long, that's really translating through to the conservation work that we're doing. And our sort of conservation strategy now is, we frame it around what we would call conservation health. And that's sort of, the welfare, not just of the animals, the wild animals, as well as those in sort of various states of captivity, and the people is sort of implicit with that. And I think that perspective is one that, as zoos, and, whatever flack is sort of, hurled at zoos generally, and some are bad and some are very good, but it's that perspective is a direct consequence of having that welfare embedded in our operation.
That's very helpful to focus on the embeddedness of these elements. You've got your hand up, Jordan. Can I pass to you?
Yeah, just something that came to my mind, tying together a few ideas that have come up in the last couple of minutes, and this relates to the idea of the 7 principles for wildlife control, and this enduring suggestion that fertility control can and should be used in many situations in which there's introduced or hyperabundant wildlife creating conflict. In my experience with some of our species in Australia that are seen to be quite charismatic but cause conflict, like our feral horses, there's some methods like fertility control that are associated with generally positive public perceptions, but which modelling shows can't enact meaningful population reduction, that are continually proposed as methods that should be used instead of lethal control. But it goes against the 3rd of the 7 principles, that if you're going to do anything harmful, invasive or painful to animals in these conflict situations, it has to be possible to actually achieve your management goal. So to achieve a meaningful reduction in abundance. And I think sometimes that connection is lost between methods that seem to have good welfare outcomes, or at least don't involve intentional killing, but that necessity within that 7 principles framework to actually be able to achieve the outcome that you are desiring.
So Glenn, you're on mute again.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I was just going to say that people are welcome to take their lunch break now, but I've been advised that we can run over. So I'm assuming that it's okay with yourselves, Jordan, Philip, Pete and Mike, just to 1 or 2 more questions. There's quite a lot for you, Mike, but I'm going to choose one that's addressed to the whole panel, and I'll read it out. Can the panel say, this is from Nick Collington, who's I think speaking later. Can the panel say a bit more about wildlife management as a tool for nature recovery? In Scotland, deer numbers are so high and hills so overgrazed, often to support the stalking industry, which I think you've spoken to, Mike, quite powerfully. Culling to enable nature recovery, as is happening on some estates, including Cousquer and Mar Lodge. Just trying to bring the whole thing up there. Hang on. Could be a tool to drive nature recovery. Nature recovery fills an important why for wildlife management in a biodiversity crisis. So I guess the invitation is for people on the panel to say a bit about wildlife management as a tool for nature recovery. And I guess that's part of trying to understand these contexts, because people may not have clarity around how population control fits in with nature recovery, perhaps, amongst other things.
I'll jump in first. I mean, no, I think that's articulated exactly what I was trying to get across. Yeah, that's the only reason we're really doing it, so that as our charitable purpose is about nature recovery in modern parlance, and therefore, yeah, that's the reason we're having to manage this particular species, which is hyper abundant. So yeah, I think that's but whether, yeah, and I guess when it comes on to the ethics of that's, one of the challenges, just to go into a slight bit of detail at the moment, is that there's legislation at the moment about extending the female reducing the close season for females, culling female deer, and there are debates around dependent young at one end of the season, and about how pregnant, the degree of pregnancy at the other end of the season, and those are really contentious debates that stray into all sorts of areas from not necessarily from an animal welfare point of view, but certainly from an ethical point of view. So yeah, I think you can't detach the fact, but I think so. So it might be fine to have that as a principle, but it doesn't remove you from the intricacies of the debate once you get down to what that looks like. So culling is generally seen as being humane if you do it, but then, as we've discussed, there's issues still with lead. Just to reassure Jordan, we're still having a debate about trying to get rid of lead in Scotland too. So we're not 10 years ahead of you yet, still, believe it or not, bizarrely, mainly for shotguns and not to do with deer. But so yeah, so there's still. So I think that doesn't remove that debate. I think culling for natural processes or for regeneration is it could be understandable, but then there still are animal welfare to consider when you cull and what species you're culling and what time of year and things.
Does anybody else want to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in, and I think I think wildlife management, I take here to euphemistically mean killing stuff in order to help other stuff. And I think that's a very narrow view, and we've already sort of talked about sort of other means of wildlife management. And I'll come back to just the point that's been echoed a few times now. The entire planet is under some form of management. And so all wildlife on this planet is under some form of management. We're not directly going out and doing things to it necessarily, but things are being done to it, just by virtue of the way that we have lived our lives and we're living our lives. So I think, I've had the dubious pleasure of being part of a number of sort of, UN initiatives, and still am, around sort of, CPD and sort of IFBES and the like. And there's always a struggle to sort of come up with what are the aims and the objectives, what are we trying to get towards in terms of sort of nature and wildlife recovery. And there's a sense that it's about that sort of self-sustaining natural ecosystems that are able to exist in an adaptive, ongoing capacity that allows for all of the sort of dynamic ecosystem interactions that we sort of, as ecologists, and I'm an ecologist by training, we sort of, we're used to talking about. But as soon, as I say, as soon as you start doing something like giving antiepileptics to a Grevy's zebra, there's a consequence. As soon as you've got some hay down, you get elephants start to come into those villages. There's a consequence. And I think it's sort of, just then sort of building the awareness of that sort of chains of consequence, being as prepared as we can be, but also having the resources and at our disposal that we can jump in when things get sort of serious and urgent. And I think if we sort of we set out those sort of the direction of travel to say, what do we want this world to be, and how do we want as people to engage within it, then we perhaps have a clearer idea of what wildlife management then entails, and what those sort of consequences and the reactions to it might have to be. So it's very.
I think, as you say, Philip, we're getting smarter at identifying some of those consequences of our actions. That there will be always some unintended consequences as well. I think also the trouble is, as you've highlighted, is that the target is always shifting by the physical changes that we see in the world around us. So I think it's always hard. It's becoming harder to have a specific goal in mind. So a reactive program is really something that's going to be needed for whatever we do. And I think also, as we become better informed, the more wildlife welfare can drive that sort of potential goal-driven agenda, the better, I would say.
And I think the sort of sad fact that we have to face is that we do not have the policymakers and the decision makers that have that in mind sufficiently, or have the ability to act in that way. And so when we are dealing, as we inevitably do, with policymakers and trying to give them the sort of policy relevant information, advice, assessments that they can then use, we have to always accept that there are some things that we might want which are just not going to be achievable within the timescales, but certainly within a democratic society that has a 5-year, for example, election cycle, is going to be able to cope with. So there's sort of, as well as the sort of, the natural ecosystem, there's that sort of political ecosystem that we really have to be better at anticipating and understanding.
I think that's a really good point to, I guess, to draw a line under this session and allow everybody to have their lunch break before the afternoon session. So I'm just going to thank you all for your contributions, and hopefully you've helped to highlight. I mean, just picking up on that last point that you made, Philip, there, that there is this interrelationship between the political, the social, and the ecological, and we have to be aware of the various feedback loops within the systems that we're seeking to I'm going to say contribute to rather than manage, because I'm not a fan of the management term, but that's probably personal to me, and it relates to I guess the way management is often involves a sort of a particular view of power, really. But I think on that point, unless Pete, you want to add a few closing words to bring this morning to a close.
Well, thanks, Glenn, for sort of steering that along, and thanks to all of you for contributing, the speakers, and also the people putting the questions in. It was sort of a challenging topic, I think, but we've had various aspects clearly explained to us, and I think we can only wish those engaged in this area good fortune, and a persuasive message to go to those that are in positions to make some change is always going to be necessary, I think. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you after the break, and we'll look forward to session 3. The title is there on the slide in front of you. So see you later. Thank you, everybody.